Every mother knows the fear of having nowhere safe to raise her child. When you're 8 months pregnant and your last $20 won't even buy groceries, a $50 cabin in the middle of nowhere starts to look like salvation. That's exactly where Maggie found herself after leaving everything behind to escape a relationship that had turned dangerous. The old cabin in the Montana woods was falling apart, with broken windows and weeds growing through the floorboards. But it was hers, and more importantly, it was far away from the man who had made her life a nightmare. While cleaning out the decades of dust and debris, Maggie discovered something behind the fireplace that would change her life forever. Hidden away were gold coins, old bonds, and handwritten letters worth over $5 million. But why did the cabin's previous owner hide this fortune and then disappear without telling anyone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie Thompson had never imagined her life would come to this. Driving a rusted Honda Civic with a sputtering engine down a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere, her belly so round she could barely fit behind the steering wheel. The ultrasound. A photo tucked into her visor fluttered with each bump, a constant reminder of why she'd made this impossible choice. 3 days ago, she'd been Dr. Margaret Thompson, a respected literature professor at Denver University, living in a comfortable, suburban home with a man she'd thought she loved. 3 days ago, she'd still believed David's promises that he would change, that his anger was just stress from work, that the bruises on her arms were accidents born from passion rather than rage. The moment everything shifted came during what should have been a celebration. The ultrasound had revealed a healthy baby girl, due in just 4 weeks. Maggie had rushed home with the news, imagining David's face lighting up with joy. Instead, she'd found him rifling through her desk drawers, her personal papers scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. "Where's your savings account password?" he'd demanded, not even looking up when she entered. "I need to move some money around." "David, we need to talk about—" "I asked you a question, Margaret." His voice carried that dangerous edge she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant she had perhaps 30 seconds to comply before his hands found their way to her throat or her wrists. But something had been different that day. Maybe it was the life growing inside her, or maybe it was seeing her grandmother's handwritten recipes torn and crumpled on the floor, the last physical connection to the woman who'd raised her after her parents died. Whatever it was, Maggie had felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "No," she'd said simply. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun. David had gone very still, then slowly risen from where he'd been crouched by her desk. In his hand was her grandmother's jewelry box, the delicate music box that played Fur Elise when opened. He'd looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the woman he'd claimed to love for 3 years. "No," he'd repeated, and then brought the jewelry box down hard against the corner of her desk. The sound of splintering wood and tangled music had broken something inside Maggie's chest. Not just the loss of another piece of her grandmother, but the sudden, crystal-clear understanding that this man would destroy everything she held dear. Her savings, her career, her independence, and eventually her child. She'd packed while he was at work the next morning, taking only what would fit in 2 suitcases and the emergency fund her grandmother had always insisted she keep hidden. $1,500 in cash, carefully saved over years of teaching. It felt like so little to build a new life on. The property listing had found her rather than the other way around. A desperate Google search for cheap housing Montana had led her to a barely functional real estate website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. Most of the listings were for trailers or tiny apartments that cost more per month than she had in total, but buried at the bottom of the 4th page was something that made her heart stop. "Cabin for sale, $50, cash only, sold as is. No warranty, remote location, serious inquiries only." The accompanying photo showed a structure that might generously be called rustic. Weathered wood siding, a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the left, and windows so grimy they looked like cataracts. But it was a roof. It was far from David, and it was $50. She'd driven straight through the night, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks that became increasingly frequent as the baby pressed against her bladder. The seller had been an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who met her at a diner in the nearest town. If you could call a gas station, a diner, and a post office clustered around a single intersection a town. "You sure about this, miss?" Frank had asked, studying her swollen belly with concerned eyes. "That place ain't been lived in for going on 30 years. Eleanor Whitmore owned it before she up and disappeared. Most folks figured she went to live with family somewhere, but nobody ever heard from her again." Maggie had slid the $50 bill across the cracked Formica table. "I'm sure." Frank had pocketed the money with a shake of his head, then handed her a single key attached to a faded leather keychain. "Well, it's yours now. Property taxes are about $40 a year if you're planning to stay. The county don't much care what happens up there, long as nobody's making trouble." Now, as her car crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, Maggie wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The photos hadn't lied exactly, but they'd been kind. The porch sagged like an old man's back, and what she'd taken for charming, weathering in the pictures, revealed itself as genuine decay. Boards hung loose from the siding, and something, possibly a family of raccoons, had built a nest in what remained of the gutters. But the bones were good. Maggie could see that much. As she hauled herself out of the car, one hand pressed against her lower back. The foundation looked solid, built from local stone that had weathered decades without shifting. The roof had holes, yes, but the basic structure remained intact. It was a small cabin, maybe 800 square feet, with a stone chimney that spoke of cozy winter evenings, and a front porch that faced west toward mountains that caught the afternoon light like gold. More importantly, it was hers. For the first time in 3 years, she stood on property that belonged to her, in a place where no one could find her, where no one could hurt her or her child. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for her. The door opened with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in decades, and Maggie stepped into her new life. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through holes in the curtains. The air smelled of old wood and something else, not unpleasant, exactly, but complex, like dried flowers and leather and the faint sweetness of candle wax. Someone had lived here once, had made this place a home. The thought brought tears to her eyes, whether from hormones or hope she couldn't say. The main room held the basics, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, built-in shelves that spoke of someone who loved books, and wide plank floors that would be beautiful once cleaned. A narrow hallway led to what must be a bedroom and bathroom, and she could see a small kitchen through an archway. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was safe. As the baby shifted inside her, a foot or elbow pressing against her ribs, Maggie placed both hands on her belly and made a promise to the little life depending on her. "We're going to be okay here," she whispered to the empty room. "We're going to make this work." She had no way of knowing that beneath her feet, behind the very fireplace that would warm them through the coming winter, lay secrets that would change not just her life, but her understanding of what it meant to survive. Maggie's first morning in the cabin dawned grey and cold, with September frost painting delicate patterns on the windows. She'd spent the night on an air mattress in the main room, wrapped in every blanket she'd brought, listening to the settling sounds of old wood and wondering if she'd made the right choice. The fireplace drew her attention immediately. It was massive, built from local river stone in an era when craftsmanship mattered more than speed. Someone had taken great care with its construction, fitting each stone with precision that spoke of pride in the work. But decades of disuse had left it filled with debris, old leaves, animal nests, and a thick layer of soot that coated everything like black snow. Cleaning it would be her first priority, if she was going to make this place livable before the Baby came. She'd need heat, and the fireplace was her only option. The cabin had no other heating system, no gas lines, no oil tank. Just this beautiful stone hearth that hadn't seen a fire in 30 years. She'd found a rusty bucket under the kitchen sink and filled it with water from the hand pump outside. The pump had taken some coaxing, but eventually yielded clear, cold water that tasted of iron and mountain snow. Armed with rags torn from an old sheet and determination born of necessity, she'd begun the slow process of removing decades of accumulation. The work was harder than she'd expected. Her pregnant belly made it difficult to maneuver in the confined space, and every position seemed to put pressure somewhere uncomfortable. But there was something meditative about the process, something that quieted the constant anxiety that had become her companion over the past 3 years with David. She started at the top, carefully removing the worst of the debris by hand. Birds had nested in the chimney at some point, leaving behind a collection of twigs and feathers that spoke of multiple generations making their home here. As she worked, deeper, she found older remnants, newspapers from the 1960s, brittle with age, used perhaps as kindling that had never been lit. It was while reaching for a particularly stubborn clump of leaves that she first noticed something odd about the back wall of the fireplace. The stones there seemed different somehow, not quite aligned with the careful pattern of the rest. She ran her hands along the surface, feeling for the irregularity her eyes had detected. The mortar around one particular stone felt softer, more crumbly than the rest. As she pressed against it, exploring its edges, the stone shifted slightly under her touch. Maggie sat back on her heels, heart suddenly racing. The movement had been subtle, but unmistakable. This stone was loose, deliberately loose, as if it had been designed to be removed. She tried to dismiss the thought. Old houses settled, mortar cracked and failed. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation, but as she examined the stone more carefully, she noticed something else. Unlike the others, which were rounded by water and weather, this one was perfectly rectangular, almost like a brick. And the space around it was just slightly too uniform, too precise to be accidental. With growing excitement that she tried to keep in check, Maggie began working at the stone's edges. The mortar crumbled away easily, as if it had been mixed with something that would deteriorate over time. After several minutes of careful prying, the stone came free in her hands. Behind it was darkness, a space perhaps 8 inches square, extending back into the wall farther than she could see. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the flashlight she'd left on the hearth. The beam of light revealed a cavity that had been deliberately carved from the original construction. It wasn't large, maybe a foot square and 2 feet deep, but it was clearly intentional. And it wasn't empty. Wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth was a bundle about the size of a loaf of bread. Beside it, something metal caught the light. A small jewelry box, tarnished with age but still recognizable. Her hands shook as she reached in to retrieve the items. The jewelry box came first. It was heavier than she'd expected, made of silver that had blackened with time. An intricate pattern of roses and vines covered its surface, and when she opened it, a tinny melody began to play, the same Für Elise that had poured from her grandmother's music box before David destroyed it. The coincidence sent chills down her spine. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, were several pieces of jewelry. A simple gold wedding band, a string of pearls that looked real, and a pair of earrings set with what might have been emeralds. But it was the bundle in oiled cloth that made her breath catch in her throat. The cloth fell away to reveal letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to grey. The paper was old but well preserved, the handwriting careful and feminine. The top letter was addressed to "My dearest Thomas," in ink that had turned brown with age, but beneath the letters was something that made Maggie's knees go weak. A small leather pouch, heavy with contents that clinked softly when moved. With trembling fingers, she loosened the drawstring and peered inside. Gold coins, At least 20 of them, each bearing dates from the 1920s and 1930s. Even in the dim light of the fireplace, they gleamed with the unmistakable luster of real gold. This wasn't possible. People didn't just leave treasure hidden in walls. There had to be an explanation, some reasonable account for why someone would hide valuable items in a fireplace and then abandon them. But as she knelt there on the dusty floor, holding a fortune in her hands, rational thought seemed as distant as her old life in Denver. A sharp pain in her lower back brought her back to reality. She'd been crouched in the fireplace for too long, and the baby was protesting the uncomfortable position. As she struggled to stand, another thought struck her, one that made her stomach clench with sudden fear. Was this legal? Did finding treasure in a house you owned make it yours? What if there were heirs, family members, who had rightful claims to these items? What if the previous owner, this Eleanor Whitmore that Frank had mentioned, had simply forgotten about them before she disappeared? And more immediately terrifying, what if someone else knew about this hiding place? What if there were people looking for these items, people who might come looking for them? The pain in her back intensified, radiating around to her belly in a way that made her gasp. She recognized the feeling from her prenatal classes, the beginning of what could be a contraction. Stress could trigger premature labor, and she was already close enough to her due date that the baby could survive if born now. As carefully as she could manage, Maggie rewrapped the treasure and placed it gently on the hearth. Whatever secrets this cabin held, whatever story these letters and coins might tell, she needed to approach it methodically. She was no longer just Maggie Thompson, running from an abusive past. She was about to become a mother, responsible for a life more precious than any treasure. But as she looked at the bundle of letters, at the faded ribbon and careful handwriting, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: curiosity. Someone had loved these items enough to hide them carefully, to preserve them for the future. Someone had hoped they would be found by the right person at the right time. Maybe, just maybe, that person was her. The next morning brought clarity with the sunrise. Maggie had spent a restless night thinking about her discovery, alternating between excitement and terror. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She would approach this methodically, like the research. And project it was. If these items belonged to someone else, she would find a way to return them. But first, she needed to understand what she'd found. She spread a clean sheet on the floor near the window where the light was best, then carefully arranged the items from the hidden cavity. In daylight, their value became even more apparent. The coins weren't just gold. They were pristine, as if they'd been saved rather than circulated. Each bore the profile of Lady Liberty and dates ranging from 1922 to 1934. Even Maggie, who knew nothing about coin collecting, understood these. Had to be worth significant money. The jewelry told a more personal story. The wedding ring was simple but elegant, engraved with "Forever Thomas 1943" in script so fine it had taken her several minutes to decipher. The earrings were definitely real emeralds, set in what looked like white gold. But it was the pearls that made her breath catch. They had the irregular shapes and deep luster that spoke of natural formation rather than cultured creation. She opened the first letter with hands that trembled slightly, both from anticipation and the awareness that she was intruding on someone's most private thoughts. "My dearest Thomas," it began in that careful feminine script, "the roses you planted before you left are blooming beautifully this year. I sit with them each morning, drinking my coffee and pretending you're here beside me, planning next year's garden." The date at the top read June 15, 1943. This was wartime correspondence, letters from a wife to a husband serving overseas. Maggie felt a pang of guilt at reading such intimate words, but the pull of the story was too strong to resist. "Mrs. Henderson, from town, brought me vegetables from her garden yesterday. She says it's Christian charity, but I think she's lonely too. Her boy shipped out with the Marines last month, and she moves through her days like a woman walking underwater. We don't speak of our fears, but they sit with us anyway, patient as cats waiting for mice. the voice that emerged from the letters. It was educated and thoughtful, someone who noticed the world around her with a poet's eye. Eleanor Whitmore, the woman Frank had mentioned, wrote with the cadence of someone who had read widely, who chose her words with care. As Maggie read through the first several letters, a picture began to emerge. Eleanor lived alone in this very cabin, tending a garden and waiting for news from Thomas. She wrote about the changing seasons, about visits from neighbors, about the small dramas of wartime life on the home front. But underneath the daily details ran a current of deep loneliness and growing anxiety. "I haven't heard from you in 6 weeks now," read a letter dated August 1943. "I know the mail is slow and I know you can't always write, but the silence feels heavy as stones, and I find myself checking the road for the Western Union boy more often than I care to admit." By October of that year, the tone had shifted markedly. "The gold we saved from your grandfather's inheritance, I've hidden it where we discussed. If something happens to me, if the worst news comes and I can't bear to go on, know that it will be there for whoever needs it most. You always said gold was security, something that couldn't be taken away by banks, or governments, or bad luck. I pray you're right." Maggie set down that letter and reached for the small leather pouch, understanding now why the coins had been so carefully preserved. This wasn't just hidden treasure. It was a woman's insurance policy, her protection against an uncertain future. Next few letters painted an increasingly desperate picture. Thomas had been declared missing in action somewhere in the Pacific Theater. Eleanor wrote to him anyway, unable to accept that her words might never reach their intended recipient. "I know you're alive somewhere," she wrote in November 1943. "I feel it in my bones, the way I feel weather coming. They say women's intuition is foolishness, but mine has never led me wrong. You're hurt perhaps, or trapped somewhere you can't send word, but you're breathing and thinking of home and fighting to get back to me." The final letter in the bundle was dated December 7th, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. "Today, I received confirmation of what my heart refused to accept. Thomas, my beloved, you died in the assault on Tarawa November 23rd. They say it was quick, that you wouldn't have suffered. They say many brave things that are supposed to comfort a widow, but words are poor substitutes for warm arms and familiar." Laughter. Maggie had to stop reading. Tears blurred her vision, and she felt the baby move restlessly, responding perhaps to her elevated heart rate. This wasn't just historical curiosity anymore. This was a woman's private grief, her most vulnerable, moments preserved in fading ink, but she couldn't stop. The story had captured her completely, this glimpse into another woman's survival during the hardest time of her life. As she reached for the next letter, she noticed something that made her pause. The handwriting was different, shakier, less controlled, and the date was from 1967, more than 20 years later. "To whoever finds these letters," it began, "my name is Eleanor Whitmore, and if you're reading this, then I am probably dead. I've lived in this cabin for 47 years, and I've been alone for most of them. The items hidden with these letters represent everything of value I have left. My wedding ring, my mother's pearls, the gold Thomas and I saved for our future." Maggie's hands shook as she continued reading. "I have no children, no close family. Left alive? The few people who remember me in town think I'm a strange old hermit who never got over her husband's death. They're not wrong, but they're not entirely right either. I survived. I made a life here, small though it may seem to the outside world. I helped when I could, saved what I could save, and tried to honor Thomas's memory by living with the courage he showed when he faced his death." The letter went on to describe a life of quiet purpose. Eleanor had taught reading to children whose parents couldn't afford school. She'd shared her garden surplus with families struggling through hard times. She'd saved every penny she could, adding to the gold Thomas had left her, creating a nest egg that had grown substantial over the decades. "But now I'm old, and I'm tired, and I feel something coming that I won't be able to fight. If you found these things, then you needed shelter badly enough to buy a falling-down cabin for next to nothing. That tells me you understand what it means to have nowhere else to go." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. It was as if Eleanor had known, somehow, exactly who would find her hidden treasure and when they would need it most. The letter continued with instructions that made Maggie's hands tremble. "Consider this a gift from one woman to another. Use what you need to build the life you deserve. The cabin and everything in it should be yours now, bought and paid for fair and square. Trust your instincts, trust your strength, and don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve safety and happiness." At the bottom, in a postscript that seemed added as an afterthought, Eleanor had written, "The loose stones aren't all near the fireplace. Look for the places where the mortar seems newer. I've left everything I could for whoever would need it most. May you have better luck in love and life than I did." Outside, a truck engine rumbled up the dirt road toward the cabin. Maggie quickly gathered the letters and items, her heart racing. Through the window, she could see a battered pickup truck approaching, dust rising behind it like a brown cloud. Someone was coming, and she had no idea if they were friend or foe. The truck belonged to an elderly man who introduced himself as Henry Patterson, Eleanor's nearest neighbor from about 2 miles down the mountain. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. "Saw smoke from your chimney yesterday," he said, standing on the sagging porch with his hat in his hands. "Figured I should come check on whoever was brave enough to take on Eleanor's old place." Maggie invited him in for coffee, grateful for the company despite her nervousness about the hidden treasure now carefully concealed in her bedroom. Henry accepted with the easy manner of someone used to mountain hospitality, settling into one of the sturdy wooden chairs by the kitchen table. "You knew Eleanor well?" Maggie asked, trying to keep her voice casual as she poured water from the hand pump into an old percolator she'd found in the kitchen. Henry's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, as anyone, I suppose, though that wasn't saying much." Eleanor kept to herself mostly, especially after she lost Thomas in the war. But she wasn't unfriendly, just careful. She'd been hurt enough for one lifetime. As the coffee brewed, Henry shared stories that brought Eleanor's later years into focus. She'd been a fixture at the small community church, always sitting in the back pew and leaving before anyone could engage her in conversation. But when the Peterson family lost their barn to fire in 1962, Eleanor had appeared the next morning with lumber and a determination to help rebuild. "She never married again?" Maggie asked. "Had a few suitors over the years. Doc Williams was sweet on her for the longest time, and Jake Morrison, Frank's older brother, used to bring her vegetables from his garden every summer. But Eleanor wasn't interested in replacing Thomas, said she'd had her great love, and that was enough for one lifetime." Henry's stories painted a picture of a woman who'd found ways to contribute to her community while maintaining careful distance from emotional entanglements. She'd helped deliver babies when the doctor couldn't make it up the mountain roads in winter. She'd sat with dying neighbors when their families couldn't bear the vigil. She'd quietly paid grocery bills for families struggling through bad harvests or medical emergencies. How did she afford to help so many people? Maggie asked, thinking of the gold coins hidden in her bedroom. Henry shrugged. Always figured she was careful with money. Thomas had been a good provider, and Eleanor was the type to save every penny. Plus, she lived simple, grew most of her own food, made her own clothes, didn't waste anything. Mountain folk learned to make do. As he spoke, Henry pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Found this in my mailbox this morning. Thought you might want to see it." The paper was a hand-drawn map of the property, sketched in faded pencil. It showed the cabin, the small barn behind it, and several other structures Maggie hadn't noticed yet. But more interesting were the small X marks scattered across the property, each labeled with cryptic notes like winter stores and emergency supplies. "Eleanor drew this?" Maggie asked, studying the careful details. Looks like her handwriting. She was always making maps and charts, keeping track of things. Organized mind, she had. Henry paused, then added quietly, "Found it after she disappeared. Always meant to show it to Frank when he was settling her affairs. But it slipped my mind until now." Maggie's pulse quickened. "How exactly did she disappear?" Henry's expression darkened. "That's the part that never sat right with me. Eleanor wasn't the type to just wander off. She was 73, but sharp as a tack and careful about everything. Yet one morning in September of 1994, her milk cow was bawling to be milked. Her chickens hadn't been fed, and Eleanor was nowhere to be found." He described the search that followed. The county sheriff had organized teams to comb the mountain, thinking Eleanor might have fallen somewhere or gotten disoriented. But they'd found no trace of her, no clothing, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate what had happened. Sheriff concluded she'd probably wandered off with dementia, maybe fell into one of the old mine shafts up the mountain. But I knew Eleanor well enough to know she wasn't suffering from any confusion. Week before she disappeared, she brought me a basket of preserved peaches, and we talked for an hour about books she'd been reading. Her mind was clear as mountain water. The mystery deepened as Henry shared more details. Eleanor's house had been left tidy, as if she'd simply stepped out for a walk. Her few valuable possessions, a silver tea service that had belonged to her mother, some jewelry, a little cash she kept in a coffee tin, were undisturbed. If she'd planned to leave, she'd taken nothing with her. What about family? Did anyone come looking for her? That's another strange thing. Eleanor always said she had no living relatives, but about a month after she disappeared, this fellow showed up claiming to be her nephew. Said he was from California, had a lawyer with him and everything. They wanted to settle her estate, said they were her only heirs. Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Did you believe them?" Henry shook his head, slowly. Something about them didn't sit right. The fellow claiming to be her nephew couldn't answer simple questions about Eleanor's life. Said he hadn't seen her since he was a child, but when I mentioned her teaching Sunday school, he acted surprised. Eleanor taught children their letters for 40 years. Anyone who knew her would know that. The story grew more troubling as Henry continued. The supposed nephew and his lawyer had been persistent, producing documents that proved their relationship to Eleanor. When the required waiting period passed with no sign of Eleanor, the court had declared her dead and transferred the property to them. They sold it to Frank about a year later, Henry concluded. Said they didn't want to deal with maintaining property so far from civilization. Frank held on to it, thinking maybe someday Eleanor would turn up and want it back. When that didn't happen, he figured he might as well sell it to someone who needed it. As Henry prepared to leave, he paused at the door and studied Maggie's face with concern. "You be careful up here, miss. I don't like the idea of a woman in your condition being alone so far from help. You got a way to call for assistance if you need it." Maggie thought of the cell phone hidden in her car, turned off to prevent David from tracking her location. "I'll be fine," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. After Henry left, Maggie returned to Eleanor's map with new understanding. The X marks weren't just organizational notes, they were hiding places. Eleanor had been preparing for something, stockpiling supplies and creating contingency plans. The question was, had she been preparing for a planned disappearance or for something more sinister? That evening, as Maggie sat by the fireplace reading more of Eleanor's letters, she felt the baby move with unusual vigor. The little one seemed restless, as if picking up on her mother's growing unease. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like whispered warnings. Eleanor's story was far from over, and Maggie had the unsettling feeling that she'd become part of it whether she wanted to or not. The treasure in her bedroom represented more than financial security. It was evidence of a mystery that someone had killed to cover up. And now she was the only one who knew the truth. 3 days after Henry's visit, Maggie found Eleanor's journal. Following the map's cryptic markings, she'd discovered the first cache behind a loose board in the small barn. Inside a metal box wrapped in oiled cloth were emergency supplies, canned goods, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and a leather-bound book that opened to reveal Eleanor's daily entries from her final months. The journal painted a picture of growing paranoia and fear that made Maggie's blood run cold. March 15th, 1994. They came again today. Two men in a brown sedan asking questions about Thomas's family, about what he might have left me. I told them the same thing I told the others, that Thomas died with nothing but his service medals and my memories, but they're not satisfied. They keep coming back. Eleanor's handwriting grew more agitated as the entries progressed. March 28th, 1994. Found tire tracks by the old logging road again. Someone's been watching the house. I've started keeping the curtains drawn during the day and moving around without patterns. If they want to play games, I can play too. 40 years of living alone on this mountain has taught me how to be invisible. The entries revealed a woman under siege, using skills honed by decades of self-reliance to evade increasingly persistent surveillance. Eleanor had noticed the same car parked at different vantage points around her property. She discovered evidence that someone had been through her garden shed and barn. Most disturbing of all, she'd begun finding signs that intruders had been inside her house while she was away. April 10th, 1994. They're getting bolder. Found muddy footprints in the kitchen this morning, and my mother's china cabinet had been moved slightly. They're looking for something specific, and they're running out of patience. I need to finish my preparations. Maggie read these entries by lamplight, her own growing pregnancy making Eleanor's vulnerability feel immediate and personal. The baby shifted restlessly as her stress increased, responding to the elevated heart rate and tension that gripped her body. The journal revealed the methodical way Eleanor had prepared for what she seemed to know was coming. She'd moved her most valuable possessions to hiding places throughout the property, using the map Maggie now possessed to track their locations. More disturbing, she'd begun documenting everything she could remember about Thomas's military service and his family. History, April 20th, 1994. I think I understand now what they're really after. It's not just about Thomas's inheritance or what we saved during the war. Thomas told me stories about his grandfather's mining claims, about gold that was never reported to the government. I thought they were just family legends, but someone else believes they're true. The picture that emerged made Maggie's stomach clench with fear. Thomas's grandfather had apparently owned several mining claims in the area during the early 1900s. When he died, those claims had passed to Thomas's father, then to Thomas himself when he enlisted. But Thomas had been killed before he could do anything with the inheritance, and Eleanor had lived quietly on the cabin property without ever investigating what else she might own. May 5th, 1994. Found the old survey maps in the county records. Thomas's grandfather owned mineral rights to over 300 acres, including most of the mountain behind our cabin. The claims were never properly transferred after Thomas died. They just sat there, abandoned but still legal. Someone's figured this out, and they want me gone so they can claim the land as abandoned property. Eleanor's final entries revealed a woman who understood she was in mortal danger but refused to be driven from her home. May 15th, 1994. They made their offer today. A man calling himself Robert Whitmore, claiming to be Thomas's cousin, wants to buy the cabin and surrounding property. Says he'll pay me a fair price and help me relocate to a nice retirement home in town. When I told him I wasn't interested, his friendly manner disappeared. He said old women living alone on mountains sometimes have accidents. He said it would be a shame if something happened to me. Maggie had to stop reading. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the journal. This wasn't just a story about a woman who disappeared 30 years ago. This was a blueprint for murder, documented by the victim herself. She forced herself to continue reading, knowing she needed to understand what had really happened to Eleanor. May 22 to 1994. I've hidden everything now. The gold, the jewelry, the documents proving Thomas's ownership of the mining rights. I've left instructions for whoever finds them, along with enough evidence to prove what really happened to me. If Robert Whitmore and his associates think they can steal what belongs to Thomas's memory, they're about to learn that some old women don't go quietly. The final entry was dated September 3rd, 1994. Just days before Eleanor's disappearance. They're coming tonight. I can feel it the way I used to feel storms approaching when I was young. The dogs have been restless all day, and there's a car parked at the bottom of the mountain that's been there since dawn. I'm not afraid anymore. I've lived a full life, longer than I had any right to expect after losing Thomas. But I'm angry. I'm angry that greedy men think they can take what doesn't belong to them just because I'm old and alone. The journal entry continued with detailed instructions about where Eleanor had hidden evidence of the threats against her, including photographs she'd taken of the men watching her property and copies of documents proving Thomas's rightful ownership of the mining claims. I've built this life with my own hands, lived by my own rules, and helped whoever I could along the way. If they think killing one old woman will give them what they want, they're wrong. The truth has a way of surviving, even when the people who know it don't. As Maggie closed the journal, she realized her situation was far more dangerous than she'd understood. The treasure she'd found wasn't just Eleanor's life savings, it was evidence of a motive for murder. And if the men who'd killed Eleanor 30 years ago discovered that someone had found her hidden cache, they might decide that history needed to repeat itself. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her mother's fear, and Maggie placed both hands on her belly in a protective gesture that felt both instinctive and futile. She was 8.5 months pregnant, alone on a mountain, with no way to call for help and nowhere to run. But Eleanor's journal had also revealed something else, the location of evidence that could expose her killers. Hidden in a metal box, buried near the old well, were photographs, documents, and testimony that could finally bring justice for a woman who died protecting what rightfully belonged to her. The question was whether Maggie had the courage to finish what Eleanor had started, or whether she'd become the next victim of men who believed that violence was an acceptable price for wealth. Outside, wind rattled the windows with increasing force, and in the distance, she could swear she heard the sound of a car engine growing closer. The next morning brought visitors that changed everything. Maggie woke to the sound of vehicles, multiple engines rumbling up the dirt road toward the cabin. Through the bedroom window, she could see a convoy approaching, a sheriff's department. SUV followed by 2 civilian cars and what looked like a county vehicle. Panic flooded her system. Had David somehow found her? Were these the same men who'd threatened Eleanor? She quickly hid the journal and treasure, then struggled into her clothes, her pregnant belly making every movement awkward and slow. The knock on her door came as she was pulling on her boots. "Ma'am?" "Sheriff's Department. We'd like to speak with you." The voice sounded official but not hostile. Maggie opened the door to find a middle-aged woman in uniform, her expression professional but kind. Behind her stood several other people, including a man with a camera and a woman carrying what looked like surveying equipment. "I'm Deputy Maria Santos," the uniformed woman said. "Are you the new owner of this property?" Maggie nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" "No problem, ma'am. We're here about Eleanor Whitmore. There's been a development in her case. New evidence has come to light, and we're reopening the investigation into her disappearance." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Someone else knew about Eleanor's hidden evidence, but who and how? Deputy Santos introduced the rest of the team, a state investigator, a forensic anthropologist, and a surveyor from the county offices. They explained that an anonymous tip had led them to believe Eleanor's disappearance wasn't voluntary, and they had reason to search the property for evidence. "We have a warrant," Deputy Santos said, showing Maggie the legal document, "but we'd appreciate your cooperation. I understand you're expecting We'll try to make this as quick and non-disruptive as possible, as the team spread out across the property. Maggie found herself walking alongside Deputy Santos, who seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare. "You bought this place recently?" Santos asked. "A few days ago, from Frank Morrison." "Frank's a good man. Known him for years." Santos paused, studying Maggie's face. "Can I ask what brought you up here? This isn't exactly the kind of place most people choose for a fresh start." Something in the deputy's tone suggested she already knew more than she was letting on. Maggie made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I was running from someone," she said quietly. "My ex-partner. He hurt me. I needed somewhere he couldn't find me." Santos nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen too many similar situations. "You feel safe here?" "I did. Until now." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the area near the old well, where the surveyor was taking measurements. Maggie's heart raced as she realized they were very close to where Eleanor had hidden her evidence. "Deputy Santos," one of the investigators called from near the barn. "You need to see this." They'd found something. Behind the barn, partially buried under decades of fallen leaves, was a metal box similar to the one Maggie had discovered. The investigator opened it carefully, revealing a collection of items that made Maggie's breath catch. Photographs of men watching the cabin, handwritten notes documenting threats, and a bundle of letters tied with string. But it was Deputy Santos who made the connection that changed everything. "These letters," she said, studying the handwriting. "They're thank you notes. Look at this one. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for helping us keep our farm. Without your loan, we would have lost everything. The Hendersons will never forget your kindness." Santos looked up at her team with growing excitement. "There are dozens of these. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just a hermit living alone on the mountain. She was quietly helping half the families in this county through hard times." The surveyor approached with news that made the picture even clearer. "The mineral rights records are fascinating. Thomas Whitmore's grandfather owned claims to most of this mountain, including areas that were never properly surveyed. If those claims are still valid, this property could be worth millions." As the investigation continued, a remarkable story emerged. Eleanor hadn't just been threatened by strangers. She'd been systematically harassed by people who knew about her husband's inheritance and wanted to claim it for themselves. The thank you letters revealed a woman who'd used her hidden wealth to help others while living modestly herself. "Mrs. Thompson," Deputy Santos said, returning to where Maggie sat on the cabin's front porch, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer, you're not in any trouble. Have you found anything unusual since you've been here? Anything that might have belonged to Eleanor?" Maggie looked into the deputy's honest eyes and made another leap of faith. "Yes," she said simply. Santos's expression didn't change, but Maggie caught the slight relaxation in her shoulders. "Would you be willing to show us?" What followed was the most surreal hour of Maggie's life. She led the investigators to her bedroom and carefully revealed Eleanor's treasure. The gold coins, the jewelry, and most importantly, the letters and journal that documented everything. The forensic expert photographed each item meticulously while the state investigator read Eleanor's journal with growing anger. When he finished, he looked up with grim determination. "This is a murder case," he announced. "Eleanor Whitmore documented her own assassination. She knew they were coming for her, and she made sure we'd have everything we needed to prove it." "Deputy." Santos sat beside Maggie on the bed, her voice gentle but urgent. "The anonymous tip that brought us here, it came from someone who claimed to have information about Eleanor's disappearance. They said we should look for evidence hidden on the property. Did you call this in?" Maggie shook her head. "I didn't know who to trust." "Then someone else knows you found these things. Someone who wants Eleanor's case reopened." Santos paused, then asked the question Maggie had been dreading. "Have you told anyone about what you discovered?" "Only Henry Patterson. He brought me a map Eleanor had drawn, and I showed him some of the letters." Santos and the state investigator exchanged a look that made Maggie's stomach clench. "Mrs. Thompson?" the investigator said carefully. Henry Patterson died 3 days ago, heart attack according to the coroner, but now I'm wondering if it was as natural as it seemed. The room spun around Maggie. Henry had been alive and healthy just days ago, sharing stories about Eleanor and expressing concern for Maggie's safety. The idea that he might have been killed because of what she'd told him made her feel sick. There's more, Deputy Santos continued. The man who claimed to be Eleanor's nephew back in 1994. Robert Whitmore? We've been trying to track him down as part of our investigation. He doesn't exist. The identity was completely fabricated, and the lawyer who helped him was disbarred years ago for fraud. As the implications sank in, Maggie felt the baby move restlessly, responding to her elevated stress. She was caught in the middle of a 30-year-old conspiracy, pregnant and vulnerable, with killers who were still alive and still protecting their secret. What happens now? She asked. The state investigator's expression was grim but determined. Now we build a case. Eleanor gave us everything we need, evidence, motive, documentation. We're going to find out who really killed her and make sure they pay for it. But that could take months or years. What about Maggie? Deputy Santos's concern was evident. If these people killed Henry because he knew too much, they'll come for her next. The investigator nodded grimly. We'll provide protection, of course, but Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand something. Eleanor Whitmore was a brave woman who refused to be intimidated by men who thought they could steal what didn't belong to them. The evidence suggests she fought back, and that's probably what got her killed. If you're willing to help us finish what she started, we can finally bring her killers to justice. Maggie placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter's movements, like a reminder of what was at stake. She thought about Eleanor, alone on this mountain, documenting her own coming murder with careful precision. She thought about Henry, dead because he'd tried to help her understand the truth. What do you need me to do? She asked. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and in the distance, thunder rumbled like an approaching army. The final confrontation Eleanor had prepared for 30 years ago was finally about to begin, and Maggie found herself cast in a role she'd never wanted, the key witness in a case that powerful people had killed to keep buried. The baby kicked hard, as if reminding her mother that some fights were worth having, no matter the cost. 2 days after the investigators left, Maggie found the final piece of Eleanor's puzzle hidden in the last place she would have thought to look. She'd been following Eleanor's map methodically, checking each marked location for additional evidence. The investigators might have missed. Most had been empty, cleared out decades ago or never used. But the final X mark led her to the cabin's root cellar, a small underground storage space she'd barely noticed because of how well it was concealed. The entrance was hidden beneath what looked like a collapsed section of the back porch. Only by clearing away the rotted boards and accumulated debris could she see the stone steps leading down into darkness. The space below was cramped but dry, lined with stone walls and shelves that had once held preserved food for winter storage. At the very back of the cellar, behind a false wall similar to the one in the fireplace, Maggie found Eleanor's final hiding place. The cavity contained a metal box that was heavier than all the others. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth, was something that made her hands shake. A sheriff's badge, tarnished with age but still bearing the distinctive star of Clearwater County. Beneath it was a letter that began with words that changed everything she thought she knew about Eleanor's story. If you're reading this, then you've found the proof of who really killed me. The badge belongs to Sheriff William Morrison, Frank's uncle, Henry's older brother. He was supposed to protect me, but instead he was the one who orchestrated everything. Maggie had to read the sentence 3 times before its meaning sank in. Frank Morrison, the man who'd sold her the cabin, was related to Eleanor's killer. Henry Patterson, who'd seemed so kind and helpful, was the nephew of the man who'd murdered her. The letter continued with devastating detail. Sheriff Morrison had been the one feeding information to the fake nephew, Robert Whitmore. He'd used his position to ensure no real investigation was conducted when Eleanor disappeared. He'd even helped dispose of her body, probably in one of the abandoned mine shafts that dotted the mountain. William Morrison knew about Thomas's mining claims because he'd helped file the original paperwork after the war. He knew I was the only thing standing between those claims and a fortune in mineral rights. He thought killing one old woman would be easy money. He was wrong about that, but right about everything else. Eleanor's final letter revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Sheriff Morrison hadn't acted alone. He'd been working with a group of local businessmen who wanted to develop the mineral rights on a massive scale. The fake nephew had been their front man, someone who could claim legal inheritance and then sell the rights to the real investors. But the most shocking revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. William Morrison died in 1998, but his son Carl has been carrying on his father's work. Carl Morrison is currently the county prosecutor, and he's been quietly buying up mineral rights throughout this region for decades. He thinks I never figured out the connection, but I've been watching the Morrison family for 30 years. I know Carl was involved in his father's plans from the beginning. Maggie's blood ran cold. Carl Morrison, the county prosecutor, was Eleanor's killer's son, and probably an accomplice in covering up the murder. If the current investigation got close to the truth, he'd be in a position to sabotage it from the inside. The letter included one final terrible detail. I've hidden this badge and confession because I know they'll try to frame someone else for my death eventually. They'll need a scapegoat if the case is ever reopened. Don't let them make you that scapegoat. Use this evidence to protect yourself and expose the truth. As if summoned by Eleanor's warning, Maggie heard the sound of cars approaching the cabin. Multiple vehicles, just like when the investigators had come. But this time, when she looked out the window, her heart stopped. Leading the convoy was a familiar brown sedan, the same type of car Eleanor had described in her journal. Behind it were two sheriff's department vehicles and a black SUV with tinted windows. These weren't investigators coming to help her. These were the people who'd killed Eleanor, and they'd come to make sure her secrets died with them. Maggie moved as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, gathering Eleanor's badge and confession letter along with the most crucial evidence from her earlier discoveries. She stuffed everything into a waterproof bag she'd found among Eleanor's supplies, then made her way toward the back of the cabin. Eleanor's journal had mentioned escape routes, places where a person could hide if the cabin became unsafe. Maggie had thought they were the paranoid preparations of a frightened old woman, but now she understood they were survival tools left by someone who'd known this day would come. Through the back window, she could see men positioning themselves around the property. They moved with military precision, cutting off all obvious escape routes. But Eleanor had been clever. Her map showed a trail that led from the root cellar to an old hunting blind about a quarter-mile up the mountain. As footsteps approached the front door, Maggie slipped into the root cellar and pulled the camouflaged entrance closed above her head. In the darkness below, she could hear muffled voices as the men entered the cabin. She's here somewhere. Car's still warm. Check every room. She can't have gone far in her condition. Frank, you sure she found the stuff? Maybe the old woman was smarter than we thought. Maggie's heart hammered as she recognized the voices. Frank Morrison was among them, the man who'd sold her the cabin, who'd seemed so concerned about her welfare. He'd been watching her from the beginning, waiting to see if she'd discover Eleanor's hidden treasure. Moving as quietly as possible, she made her way to the back of the root cellar, where Eleanor's map indicated a tunnel leading to the escape route. The passage was narrow and cramped, clearly designed for someone smaller than a pregnant woman, but desperation gave her strength. Behind her, she could hear the men systematically searching the cabin. They were getting closer to finding the route. Cellar entrance. She had minutes, maybe less, before they discovered her hiding place. The tunnel emerged behind a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from the cabin. From there, Eleanor's route led through thick forest to the hunting blind, where more supplies waited. But as Maggie emerged into daylight, she saw something that made her stomach clench with terror. A man was waiting for her, leaning casually against a tree, as if he'd known exactly where she would emerge. He was middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the mountain wilderness. When he smiled, she knew immediately who he was. "Hello, Maggie," Carl Morrison said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. "I think it's time we had a conversation about what you found in Eleanor's cabin, and more importantly, what you're going to do with it." In his hand was a gun, pointed directly at her swollen belly. Behind him, she could see more men emerging from the forest. They'd known about Eleanor's escape route all along. They'd been waiting 30 years for someone to find Eleanor's evidence, and now they were going to make sure that evidence disappeared forever, along with the only person who could testify to its existence. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the danger. Maggie placed both hands protectively over her belly and faced the men who'd killed Eleanor Whitmore. This time, they weren't going to let anyone escape alive. Carl Morrison's smile never wavered as he gestured with his gun for Maggie to move back toward the cabin. "You know, Eleanor was a stubborn old woman, but she was also predictable. She thought she was so clever with her hiding places and escape routes. What she didn't realize was that we'd been watching her for months before we acted. We knew about every cache, every tunnel, every plan she made." "Then why didn't you find the evidence before now?" Maggie asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Because we didn't need to find it. We just needed to make sure no one else did." Carl's expression hardened. "Eleanor died with her secrets, or so we thought. We never imagined someone would be desperate enough to buy that worthless cabin and actually live in it." As they walked back toward the cabin, Carl explained the elaborate deception they'd maintained for 30 years. Sheriff Morrison had indeed orchestrated Eleanor's murder, but it had been Carl, fresh out of law school and eager to make his mark, who'd planned the legal framework that allowed them to claim her property. "The fake nephew was my idea," he said with evident pride. "Create a fictional heir, wait the required time for Eleanor to be declared dead, then inherit everything legally. It would have worked perfectly if Eleanor hadn't been so paranoid about hiding things." Frank Morrison and 2 other men were waiting by the cabin, their expressions grim but determined. Maggie recognized one of them as the man Henry had described from Eleanor's journal, the supposed nephew who'd threatened her all those years ago. He was older now, grey-haired and weathered, but his eyes held the same cold calculation Eleanor had documented. "Did you find the rest of it?" Carl asked Frank. Frank held up the leather pouch containing Eleanor's gold coins. "Found this in the bedroom, along with some letters and jewelry, but there's got to be more. The old woman had to have hidden the really valuable stuff somewhere else." "There is more," Maggie said, making a desperate calculation, "but I'm the only one who knows where it is." It was a lie, but she hoped it would buy her time. The baby was moving more frequently now, responding to her stress with increasing agitation. She recognized the signs from her prenatal classes, early labor symptoms triggered by extreme anxiety. Carl studied her face with the practiced eye of someone used to determining when people were lying. "What kind of more?" "Documents," Maggie said, thinking of Eleanor's final letter still hidden in the waterproof bag. Eleanor wrote down everything. Names, dates, who was involved. She even kept evidence of the threats against her. The men exchanged glances that confirmed her suspicion. There were more people involved in this conspiracy than just the Morrison family. Probably judges, other law enforcement officials, maybe even state politicians. The mineral rights Eleanor had inherited were worth enough to corrupt an entire system. "Where?" Carl demanded. "I'll show you," Maggie said. "But first I want to know what happened to Henry Patterson." "Did you kill him too?" Frank's expression flickered with what might have been guilt. Henry was getting too curious. Started asking questions about Eleanor's disappearance, wondering why the investigation was closed so quickly. "We tried to warn," him off, but he wouldn't listen. Heart attack, the fake nephew added with a cruel smile. Amazing how cardiac arrest can strike anyone at any time, especially when they're under stress. The casual admission of Henry's murder made Maggie's knees go weak. These men had killed twice to protect their secret, and they were planning to kill again. The only question was whether they'd make it look accidental this time too. A sharp pain in her lower back made her gasp and stumble. The baby was definitely responding to the stress, and labor might be starting whether she was ready or not. The timing couldn't have been worse. She needed all her strength and mobility to have any chance of surviving this encounter. "What's wrong with her?" Carl asked Frank. "She's pregnant, you idiot. Looks like the baby's coming." Carl considered this development with the dispassionate calculation of someone planning a tactical operation. "How long do these things take?" "Hours. Usually," Frank replied. "First babies especially." "Good. That gives us time to find what we need and clean up properly." Carl turned back to Maggie. "Show us where Eleanor hid the documents." Maggie led them toward the old well, moving slowly both because of her condition and because she was desperately trying to think of a way out of this situation. The well was where Eleanor had hidden some evidence, but not the most crucial items. If she could convince them they'd found everything, maybe they'd let their guard down. But as they approached the well, another contraction hit her, stronger this time, unmistakably real. She couldn't suppress a cry of pain. And all four men turned to stare at her. "This is moving faster than expected," Frank observed. Carl's expression showed no sympathy, only calculation. "Change your plans. We need to finish this now." He was raising his gun when the sound of approaching vehicles made everyone freeze. Multiple engines coming fast up the mountain road. Carl grabbed Maggie's arm and pulled her behind the well as the first sheriff's department SUV crested the hill. "What did you do?" he hissed in her ear. "Nothing," Maggie gasped, another contraction making speech difficult. "I don't know who that is." But even as she said it, she felt a surge of hope. The cavalry was arriving just when she needed it most. Whether it was Deputy Santos following up on the investigation or someone else entirely, it represented her best chance of survival. Carl was speaking urgently into a radio, coordinating with someone Maggie couldn't see. It became clear that this wasn't a spontaneous visit. Someone had called in law enforcement, and the conspiracy was large enough to include people who could respond to such calls. "Unit 7, this is Morrison. We have a situation at the Whitmore property. Suspect is armed and holding a hostage. Request immediate backup and perimeter establishment." Maggie realized with growing horror that Carl was going to frame her for something. He was going to make it look like she was the dangerous one, that law enforcement had been forced to use deadly force to protect innocent civilians. As the sheriff's vehicles positioned themselves around the property, Carl pressed his gun against her back and whispered instructions that made her blood run cold. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out there with this gun in your hands. You're going to make threatening gestures toward the officers. And then you're going to die in a hail of gunfire, along with any evidence you might have." "Hound." Another contraction hit her, stronger than the previous ones. The baby was definitely coming, and soon. In the midst of this deadly situation, new life was demanding to be born. "What about the baby?" she managed to ask. Carl's smile was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. Tragic collateral damage. Sometimes innocent lives are lost when dangerous. Fugitives resist arrest. As he forced her to stand and begin walking toward the sheriff's vehicles, Maggie realized that Eleanor's final warning had been prophetic. They were going to make her the scapegoat, just as Eleanor had predicted. But Eleanor had also left her the tools to fight back. The waterproof bag with the sheriff's badge and confession letter was still hidden in her jacket. If she could find a way to get that evidence to the real investigators, Eleanor's killers would finally face justice. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to make that happen. As Carl forced Maggie toward the sheriff's vehicles, Everything changed in an instant. The lead SUV's door opened and Deputy Maria Santos stepped out, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came the state investigator, followed by two men in FBI windbreakers. These weren't Carl's corrupt associates. These were the real investigators, and they'd arrived at exactly the right moment. "Carl Morrison!" Santos called out, her weapon drawn and trained on him. "Federal agents, drop your weapon and step away." From Mrs. Thompson, Carl's grip on Maggie tightened, his gun now pressed against her temple. "Stay back. She's armed and dangerous. She killed Henry Patterson and she's been threatening to—" "We know who killed Henry Patterson," the state investigator interrupted. "We also know who killed Eleanor Whitmore 30 years ago. It's over, Carl." Behind the law enforcement vehicles, Maggie could see Frank Morrison and his associates trying to slip away into the forest. But more agents were emerging from concealment. Surrounding the entire property, someone had planned this operation carefully. How? Carl demanded, his composure finally cracking. "Anonymous tip," Santos replied. "Someone called in your exact location and warned us you were planning to kill Mrs. Thompson and frame her for Henry's murder. They also told us where to find the evidence Eleanor hid, all of it." Another contraction hit Maggie, so strong it made her cry out and double over. The baby was coming whether the situation was resolved or not. Carl's grip loosened momentarily as he tried to keep her upright, and she saw her chance. Eleanor's emergency birth kit was hidden in the root cellar, but there were basic medical supplies in the cabin itself. More importantly, she had Eleanor's final confession hidden in her jacket, the proof that would end this conspiracy once and for all. "The baby's coming," she gasped, and it wasn't an act. Labor was progressing rapidly. Triggered by stress and terror, "We need an ambulance," Santos called into her radio. "Pregnant woman in active labor." "No time for that," the state investigator replied, moving closer. "We need to get her inside where it's safe." Carl was trapped now, surrounded by federal agents with nowhere to run, but cornered men with guns were the most dangerous kind, and Maggie could feel his desperation in the trembling of his hands. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "The mineral rights on this mountain are worth hundreds of millions. We're talking about enough rare earth metals to supply half the country's tech industry. Eleanor Whitmore was one old woman standing in the way of progress that could benefit thousands of people." "So you killed her," Santos said flatly. "My father." "And killed her. I just made sure it stayed buried." Another contraction made Maggie gasp and stumble. This time Carl's grip slipped entirely, and she managed to break free. She stumbled toward the cabin, one hand pressed to her belly, the other clutching the waterproof bag hidden in her jacket. Carl raised his gun, but before he could fire, Santos put 2 rounds center mass. He dropped instantly, his weapon flying. From his hand to land in the dirt several feet away, Maggie made it to the cabin's front porch before the next contraction hit. This one was different, stronger, more urgent. Her water broke as she reached the door, and she knew there was no time to get to a hospital. "Help me," she called to Santos, who was running toward her. "The baby's coming now." What followed was the most surreal hour of Maggie's life. While FBI agents secured the crime scene and arrested Frank Morrison and his associates, Deputy Santos helped deliver Maggie's daughter using supplies from Eleanor's carefully maintained emergency kit. Eleanor had thought of everything. Clean sheets, medical instruments, even instructions written in her careful handwriting for emergency childbirth. It was as if she'd known that someday someone would need these exact supplies under exactly these circumstances. "She's beautiful," Santos said, placing the crying infant on Maggie's chest. "Perfect little girl." As Maggie held her daughter for the first time, she felt Eleanor's presence as strongly as if the older woman were standing in the room. This cabin had seen so much sorrow and fear, but now it was witnessing the beginning of new life, new hope. The state investigator appeared in the doorway, his expression mixing relief with professional satisfaction. "We got them all," he announced. Frank Morrison, his associates, and 3 other officials who were part of the conspiracy. Carl's still alive. He'll stand trial for multiple murders. What about the evidence? Maggie asked, finally pulling the waterproof bag from her jacket. Eleanor left a final confession. She knew exactly who killed her and why. As Santos examined Eleanor's sheriff's badge and final letter, tears came to her eyes. She never stopped fighting, she said quietly, even knowing they were going to kill her. She made sure the truth would survive. Outside, the mountain was peaceful again. The corrupt officials were in custody. Eleanor's killers would finally face justice. A new life had entered the world, in the same place where so much death had been planned. But Maggie's greatest challenge was still ahead of her. She was now a mother, responsible for protecting the tiny life in her arms while building a future from the ashes of the past. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that seemed almost surreal after the life and death drama that had preceded it. Paramedics arrived from the valley below, checking both Maggie and her newborn daughter with professional thoroughness. The baby was pronounced healthy and strong, while Maggie had suffered no complications despite the traumatic circumstances of the delivery. "She's perfect," the lead paramedic announced. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and lungs that work just fine. "You did good, Mom." As medical personnel worked around her, Maggie watched through the cabin windows as FBI agents methodically processed the crime scene. Frank Morrison sat in the back of a sheriff's vehicle, his head in his hands, while his associates were loaded into a prison transport van. The fake nephew, whose real name turned out to be Walter Clemens, was cooperating fully with investigators, apparently hoping for a reduced sentence. From what Maggie could overhear, he was providing details about a conspiracy that reached much deeper than anyone had suspected. Deputy Santos approached the cabin with news that would change everything. "The mineral rights survey is complete," she announced. "Eleanor's property, your property now, sits on top of one of the largest rare earth mineral deposits ever discovered in North America. Conservative estimates put the value at over $200 million. Maggie looked down at her sleeping daughter, then around the humble cabin that had become their sanctuary. "What does that mean for us?" "It means you have choices," Santos replied. "You can lease the mining rights and become very wealthy while staying here. You can sell them outright and move anywhere you want. Or you can do what Eleanor did, sit on them and make sure they're developed responsibly, if at all." The state investigator joined them, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to know that Eleanor Whitmore left very specific instructions about what should happen if someone discovered her evidence. She wrote a will, properly witnessed and notarized, that transfers all her property and assets to whoever was brave enough to find the truth and see justice done." He handed her a legal document that made her eyes widen. Eleanor had indeed thought of everything. Not only had she hidden evidence of her own murder, but she'd created a legal framework that would protect whoever found that evidence and ensure they could benefit from her legacy. She knew someone would eventually need what she was protecting, the investigator continued. Someone running from violence, someone with nowhere else to go. She wanted to make sure that person would have the resources to build a new life. Outside, a commotion drew their attention. A black sedan was approaching the cabin, followed by news vans and what looked like government vehicles. Word of the discovery had leaked, and the media circus was beginning. "Time to make some decisions," Santos said gently. "Once this story goes public, your life is going to change dramatically. Are you ready for that?" Maggie looked around the cabin that had become her refuge, then down at her daughter's peaceful face. Eleanor had lived here for decades, choosing isolation and simplicity over wealth and attention. But Eleanor hadn't had a child to think about. "What would happen if I sold the mining rights?" she asked. "You'd be set for life," the investigator replied. "You could live anywhere, do anything. Your daughter would have every opportunity in the world. And if I keep them, you'd have ongoing income from lease agreements, but you'd also have ongoing responsibility. mining operations, environmental oversight, community relations. It's not easy money. As if sensing her mother's contemplation, the baby stirred and opened her eyes for the first time. They were dark blue, like Maggie's own, but with flecks of green that reminded her of the mountain forests surrounding them. "Hello, little one," Maggie whispered. "Welcome to your complicated new world." The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. This place had saved them both. Eleanor's courage and foresight had given them not just safety, but a future. The least they could do was honor that gift responsibly. "I want to set up a foundation," Maggie announced, "something that helps other women in situations like mine, women running from violence, needing a safe place to start over. The mining. Rights can fund it, but any development has to be done sustainably, with respect for the mountain and the community." Santos smiled. Eleanor would have liked that. As the media began setting up outside, Maggie made another decision. She asked Santos to help her record a statement while the events were still fresh in her memory. Not for the press, but for her daughter, so that someday, when she was old enough to understand, she would know the story of the brave woman whose legacy had saved them both. "Your name," Maggie said, looking down at her daughter. "I want to call you Eleanor. Eleanor Thompson. You're named after a hero." Outside, the first news helicopter was arriving, and Maggie could see reporters preparing for what would undoubtedly become a national story. But inside the cabin, holding her newborn daughter, she felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Eleanor Whitmore's fight was finally over. Eleanor Thompson's life was just beginning, and both women would carry forward the legacy of courage that had made their survival possible. 6 months later, the cabin looked like a different place entirely. The broken windows had been replaced with energy-efficient glass that let in the mountain light while keeping out the winter cold. The sagging porch had been rebuilt with local timber, creating a wraparound deck that faced the western mountains. Solar panels gleamed on the new metal roof, and a small wind turbine turned quietly in the constant mountain breeze. But the changes weren't just cosmetic. The cabin had become the headquarters of the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping women escape domestic violence. What had started as Maggie's simple desire to honor Eleanor's memory had grown into something much larger. Maggie sat in the rocking chair on the front porch, nursing 6-month-old Eleanor while reviewing applications for the Foundation's latest program. They'd helped 17 women in the past 4 months, providing not just safe housing, but job training, legal assistance, and the kind of comprehensive support that made real fresh starts possible. The mining rights had been leased to a company, specializing in environmentally responsible extraction, generating enough income to fund the Foundation's work while preserving the mountain's natural beauty. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie that the same mineral wealth men had killed for was now being used to save lives. Mrs. Thompson, a young woman, approached the porch, carrying a suitcase and looking around with the same mixture of hope and uncertainty Maggie remembered from her own arrival. "Call me Maggie," she replied, standing to greet the newest arrival. "You must be Sarah." Sarah Chen was 26, with bruises that were still healing, and eyes that held the same fear Maggie recognized from her own mirror. She'd driven from Seattle with her 3-year-old son, following the same desperate path that had brought Maggie to this mountain sanctuary. "Is it really safe here?" Sarah asked, glancing around as if expecting danger to emerge from the forest. "It's safe," Maggie assured her, remembering how impossible those words had once seemed. "Come inside, let me show you around." The cabin now housed a small apartment where women could stay while they got back on their feet, along with offices for the Foundation's growing staff. Deputy Santos had taken early retirement to become the Foundation's security director, bringing both law enforcement expertise and a deep understanding of what survivors needed to feel protected. As Maggie gave Sarah the tour, she found herself thinking about how much had changed since that desperate night when she'd first arrived. The trial of Carl Morrison and his co-conspirators had dominated headlines for months, exposing a corruption network that reached into state government. Carl had been sentenced to life without parole for multiple murders, while Frank Morrison and the others received lengthy prison terms. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in moments like this, when another woman found safety and hope in the place where Eleanor Whitmore had made her final stand. "There's something else I want to show you," Maggie said, leading Sarah to what had once been Eleanor's bedroom. The walls now held framed photographs, pictures of the women who'd found refuge here, letters from children who'd grown up safe because their mothers had escaped violence, news clippings about the Foundation's work, but the centerpiece was Eleanor's original letter, carefully preserved under glass, with its message of courage and hope visible to anyone who needed to remember that. Survival was possible. Who was Eleanor? Sarah asked, reading the letter with growing amazement. Maggie settled baby Eleanor in her crib, the same crib that had been hidden in Eleanor's emergency supplies, as if she'd known a baby would someday need it, and began to tell the story. She told Sarah about a woman who'd faced impossible odds with quiet courage, who'd prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, who'd used her final moments to ensure that justice would eventually prevail. "She saved you," Sarah said when the story was finished. "She saved all of us," Maggie replied. Eleanor understood something important, that sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to make sure others don't have to lose what we lost. That evening, after Sarah and her son were settled in their temporary apartment, Maggie took her own daughter out to the restored garden behind the cabin. Eleanor's rose bushes, carefully tended and brought back to life, were blooming with late season. Flowers that filled the air with fragrance. "Your namesake was quite a woman," she told baby Eleanor, who gurgled contentedly in her arms. "She lived through the worst thing that could happen to a person, losing the love of her life to war, and she still found ways to help others, to build something beautiful from something terrible." The mountain was peaceful in the evening light, with no sign of the violence and corruption that had once threatened to destroy everything Eleanor had built. The Foundation's work was expanding, with satellite locations planned in 3 other states. The model Eleanor had unknowingly created, using hidden resources to help the most vulnerable, was proving successful beyond anything Maggie had imagined. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Maggie felt a presence she'd come to recognize. It wasn't supernatural or mystical, just the sense that the courage and determination of one woman could echo through time, inspiring others to find strength they didn't know they possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Santos. "Another referral coming your way tomorrow. Single mother, 2 kids, needs immediate placement. Are you ready?" Maggie looked around at the cabin that had become a beacon of hope, at her daughter who would grow up knowing that women could overcome anything. When they supported each other, at the garden where Eleanor's roses bloomed eternal. "We're ready," she texted back. In the distance, a car engine rumbled up the mountain road, another woman seeking sanctuary, another chance for Eleanor's legacy to save a life. The cycle continued, as it always would, because some gifts are too precious to keep to yourself. Baby Eleanor smiled in her sleep, as if she could already sense the important work that lay ahead of her. She would grow up in a place where courage was honored, where survival was celebrated, and where the story of one brave woman continued to inspire others to write better endings to their own stories. The mountain kept its secrets, but the best secret of all was no longer hidden. That love and courage could triumph over greed and violence, that hope could grow in the darkest places, and that sometimes the most valuable treasure wasn't gold or jewels, but the simple knowledge that you were not alone in the fight. Eleanor Whitmore's story was finally complete. Eleanor Thompson's story was just beginning. And in the quiet strength of mountain women helping mountain women, both legacies would live forever.